Hello, Royalers. Welcome to another edition of Royal, Black, and Elite. I am your social historian and lecturer, Lady TrenettWilson. And as always, thank you for joining me. I hope your holiday season has been wonderful. You've been able to spend some time with your family, and we're getting right into our story as we have another great story about a man no one ever knew about, but you're going to learn about today. England, the land most identified with European royalty, from the crown jewels to the elite set. So often missing in these stories are the black men and women who were at the heart of it all. Not only as servants, but they were also royals and business owners. One such business owner and landowner in England was once a slave, but he rose up to leave a beautiful legacy about his life. Join me today as we travel across the pond and learn about an incredible life, that of George John Scipio Africanus. The presence of the black middle class in England began with the arrival of blacks as slaves. So originally, when they came over, they were slaves when the slave trade was going on, and then they were shipped to other countries. But some they stayed in England, and they primarily served as domestics. Now, if you want to hear more about Britain's role in the slave trade, be sure to click on the video. This was the case with George. George came, or shall I say Africanus, because you'll see another George name. So I'm going to say Africanus. There are no reliable records that exist regarding his birth date. So we don't know when he was born, but in the obituary in the Nottingham Journal, it was dated May 30th, 1834. That was when he passed away. And it stated he was born sometime around 1763 in Sierra Leone, which became a British colony in 1787. So, needless to say, his birth is shrouded in mystery. But by 1766, we see he was baptized as George John Scipio Africanus when he was 3 years old. Africanus was a general name given often to people from North Africa, and it was also the name of the Roman general who defeated Carthage. Now, Africanus was brought to England by Benjamin Molyneux, and Mr. Molyneux was a wealthy a master, a merchant, and a banker. A local newspaper announced Benjamin bringing Africanus here as a Negro boy belonging to Benjamin Molyneux. So, how rude, but this is how they announced, and this is how we know how Africanus got to England. Now, Benjamin liked Africanus, so he actually allowed him to be educated. And that was a rarity at the time for slaves in America and in England. And upon Benjamin's passing, when Africanus was about 9 years old, his son, who was named George, and I mentioned that earlier, so that's why I'm calling him Africanus, George continued Africanus's education, and he even permitted him to become an apprentice at one of the Molyneux's many factories in the neighboring town of Wolverhampton. He was trained as a brass founder, and this really positioned Africanus to be one of the leading blacks in Nottingham. And Nottingham was going through a lot of political unrest at the time, and Africanus was kind of in the middle of it because he worked at a factory. And during that time, they had something called the Luddite protest. And the protest was all about the factories and the fact that they were getting machines that were replacing the workers. And that wasn't a good thing. So they were picketing and rioting, and it was a big brouhaha about that. Now, during this time, Africanus also met his wife. Her name was Esther Shaw, and she was a local woman. They married in August 1788. Here's their marriage license. Now, Africanus and his wife also opened a business called the Africanus Register's Office, and they opened it up at 28 Chandler's Lane. That was actually where their home was. They ran that business for over 50 years, and Esther actually held it down even after Africanus had passed away. Africanus was really before his time because this business, they put the domestics to work. And so they had a maid service basically, and they were very, very successful in doing it but they still had to work a little bit outside of the registry service. So they both took jobs because during that time, England was suffering financially because of the wars and because they had had a really bad harvest. So that's what kind of the social environment was, the financial environment was, even though he was a middle class black man, that there was some financial hardship. So he did work, but the other thing that he did was vote. Afrikaners actually voted in three Nottingham general elections, one in 1818, one in 1820, and one in 1826. And the one in 1826 was all about the abolition of slavery. He also added his name as a special constable and being added to the City Watch Registry in 1816. So he's very active politically. And most of all, he was what they called a freeholder. Basically, what that meant is he owned his property outright. So his financial standing and his voice, really helped the fight along the way as we look at the British Empire abolishing slavery. That completely got abolished in the British Empire in 1833, 1 year before Afrikaners passed away. But actually, Afrikaners was freed in 1793. So he was already free, but he fought for others to be free. Even though he, by that time, wasn't working two jobs anymore, his business was supporting him. He was a very well-respected man in Nottingham. We mentioned the titles that he held, but to know that he still fought, even though he had reached the pinnacle of where he wanted to be, he wasn't happy until he brought other people with him, other black people with him. So kudos to him. Now, on a personal note, this is really sad. On a personal note, Afrikaners had 7 children, but only one of them lived to adulthood. Her name was Hannah. And Hannah and they kind of fell out. And so he did some things in his will because of it. They had an argument because Hannah, in his opinion, married a scoundrel. Now, his name was Samuel Cooper, and he was a watchmaker. But, he was kind of on and off, and he didn't really make a lot of money. And so Afrikaners, upon his passing, he did provide for his daughter. So he did leave some money for her. And he provided for Anna's daughter, who was disabled. Her name was Sarah Ann. And he did provide for her in his death, and his wife. Of course, he took care of his wife in his will. So it is so funny because he provided for her, and he was smart because in the will, he wouldn't let Samuel get any money, and it turned out to be good because the mother had to take care of the child and Sarah and Ann. So she took him to court, and she won. So she got paid for having to take care of her daughter in the absence of the husband who had betrayed her and basically abandoned them. So they got a divorce, but George kind of knew what he was talking about. Now, the circumstances surrounding Afrikanus' death is unknown, only that he passed away on May 19, 1834, and he is buried on the grounds of the church that he was christened at, St. Mary's Church in Nottingham. His wife is buried right next to him, and his 7 children and granddaughter were buried nearby. Also, after Afrikanus' death, Esther did remarry, but her husband passed away before she did as well. He's actually the owner of the Charter House Toys, and he was very successful. And upon his passing, he left Esther $2 million. Now, in 2003, St. Mary's erected a plaque to honor Afrikanus, so we see an example of it here. Also, they had one erected, a Blue Heritage plaque, at his home at 28 Chandler. George Scipio Africanus. Had you ever heard of him? I certainly hadn't. I was so glad to be able to share him with you today. And you'll learn a little bit more about him and the Royal Black and Elite. Be sure to go out to Amazon. The 2nd edition is coming out in January. There's going to be 20 new people in there. And so I am just excited to continue to share these stories, especially with you, my Royalers. I can't thank you enough for liking, sharing, and subscribing. As always, I'm just overwhelmed with you all tuning in each week. Thank you so very much for tuning in for another great episode of Royal Black in Elite. I'll see you the next time.